As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the small town, Sarah wiped down the counter with quick, methodical movements. The diner was nearly empty, save for a couple of late-night truckers nursing coffee in the corner booth. It had been a long shift, and her feet ached as she glanced at the clock above the register. Just a few more minutes, and she could clock out. The familiar smell of grease and old coffee hung in the air, but there was something oddly peaceful about the routine. The clink of silverware, the sizzle of bacon on the grill, the sound of the door jingling as customers came and went, it was the comforting noise of normalcy. Just as she was about to clean off another table, the door swung open, causing the bell to jangle noisily. In stepped a man, weathered and slow, his face hidden under a thick, dark helmet. He walked with a slight shuffle, each step heavy, but there was something unmistakable about him, the kind of person who had seen life on the road, the kind of person you don't mess with. His leather jacket was worn but meticulously cared for, covered in patches that marked his history on the open road. He was old, but his presence demanded attention. Sarah gave him a polite nod as he made his way to the counter. His eyes met hers, his gaze tired but kind. She greeted him the way she always greeted customers. "Evening. What can I get you?" she asked, ready to take his order. Before he could answer, the door slammed open again, and a group of teenagers rushed inside, laughing and pushing each other. They wore oversized hoodies and jeans, the typical, bad boy, look that came with their age. They immediately took notice of the elderly man sitting at the counter. One of them, a lanky kid with a mop of messy hair, walked over to the elderly man. Without warning, he swiped the man's helmet from the counter, holding it high above his head. "Hey, Grandpa," he yelled. "What's this thing? Some kind of antique?" His friends cackled behind him. The old man didn't react. His hands rested on the counter, his shoulders slumped, as if the weight of the world was on him. Sarah felt a pang of sympathy for him. He wasn't bothering anyone. Why couldn't they just leave him alone? The group of teens circled him like vultures, taking turns poking fun, calling him names, and laughing loudly. Sarah's stomach churned. She'd seen bullies before, but this felt different, too real. They were picking on someone who couldn't defend himself, and that made her blood boil. She watched the elderly man's eyes. He seemed to shrink further into his seat, as though he were trying to disappear. She couldn't let this go on. Taking a deep breath, Sarah walked toward them, her heart pounding in her chest. "That's enough," she said, her voice firm but calm. "Leave him alone." The teens stopped. They turned toward her, sizing her up with a mixture of amusement and disdain. One of them, a tall kid with a cocky grin, stepped forward. "What's the matter, waitress? You have a thing for old men or something?" Sarah felt the sting of his words, but she didn't back down. "No, I just don't like seeing people get bullied." "Now, give him back his helmet." The tall kid tilted his head, pretending to think. "What if we don't?" Her pulse quickened. She had no idea where this was going, but she wasn't about to let him or his friends get away with this. The old man was no threat to them. Why couldn't they see that? "Just leave him alone," she said again, taking a step closer. The kid smirked, then turned to his friends. "What do you think, guys? Should we give the waitress a lesson?" The tension in the room thickened, the atmosphere crackling with hostility. The other teens, sensing an opportunity to make the situation worse, began egging each other on. One of them shoved the elderly man's shoulder. Another snatched a napkin and threw it in his face. The old man flinched, his eyes darting around as if he were searching for a way to escape. That was the breaking point for Sarah. Without thinking, she stepped between the teens and the old man, blocking their way. "I said, stop it," she snapped, her voice trembling with both anger and fear. She had no idea how she was going to stop this, but she couldn't just stand by and watch. One of the teens, a stocky kid with a sneer, shoved her aside. "Back off, lady," he growled. "We're just having some fun." Her body tensed as she fought to stay calm. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, her hands clenched into fists. This wasn't fun. This wasn't a joke. These kids were crossing a line, and they didn't even realize it. Another shove. This time, the old man lurched forward, nearly falling out of his seat. Sarah reacted instinctively, rushing to his side and catching him just in time. "Hey, watch it," she yelled, the anger bubbling to the surface. She helped him back into his seat, her eyes darting around the room, searching for anyone who could help. But the manager was nowhere to be found. The teens took a step back, sensing they might have gone too far, but instead of leaving, they just stood there, smirking, waiting for something to happen. It was clear they weren't done. That's when the manager appeared, walking through the door with a tired expression. His eyes flicked over the scene quickly, taking in the bully group, Sarah standing in front of the old man, and the elderly man's frail form. His gaze settled on Sarah, and his face hardened. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "They're bullying him," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't just stand there and do nothing." The manager sighed, running a hand over his face. "Sarah, I've warned you about getting involved in these things. You need to calm down." But Sarah started to protest, but he cut her off. "I'm sorry, but you're fired," he said, his voice final. "You're a liability. You can't be causing scenes in my diner. I need employees who stay out of trouble." The words hit Sarah like a slap. Fired. Just like that. For standing up to bullies. She opened her mouth to argue, but the manager was already turning away, his back to her as he motioned for the teens to leave. The anger inside her bubbled up again, but this time it was mixed with disbelief. She had just done what was right, and now she was being punished for it. It didn't make sense. None of it did. She grabbed her bag, her fingers trembling as she slung it over her shoulder. She didn't even look at the teens as they left, their laughter echoing through the diner. "Good riddance," Sarah muttered under her breath, her heart still pounding. She turned to the old man, who was still sitting there, his eyes wide with confusion. "I'm sorry," she said, offering him a weak smile. "I didn't mean for all this to happen." He nodded slowly, his lips parting as though he wanted to say something, but then he fell silent. Sarah gave him one last glance before heading for the door. Outside, the cool night air hit her like a slap. She didn't know where she was going. She just needed to get away from the diner, away from the injustice of it all. She walked aimlessly down the street, the sound of her footsteps the only noise in the quiet night. It was then that she heard it. A sound in the distance, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. The rumble of engines. At first, she thought it was just a few motorcycles passing through, but the sound grew and grew until it was deafening. The ground seemed to shake beneath her feet. She turned around, her heart racing in her chest. The streetlights flickered as headlights began to appear on the horizon. She squinted into the distance, trying to make out what was happening. Then she saw them. Hundreds of motorcycles. Hundreds of bikers. All heading straight toward the diner. Sarah stood frozen in place as the sound of rumbling engines grew louder. Her mind couldn't comprehend what she was hearing. Was she imagining it? No, the roar of the motorcycles was too real, too intense. The ground beneath her feet seemed to vibrate with the force of their arrival. She turned back toward the diner, her breath catching in her throat. The headlights of hundreds of motorcycles cut through the darkness, drawing nearer with each passing second. For a moment, she stood there, unsure of what was happening or why it was happening. Her first instinct was to run, to hide. But something kept her rooted to the spot, an invisible pull she couldn't resist. The air was thick with tension as the bikes approached. The headlights illuminated the street, casting long shadows that twisted and danced in the night. The unmistakable sound of revving engines filled her ears, each passing second amplifying the intensity. In the distance, she saw them, bikers, one after another, as far as her eyes could see. The sight was enough to make her heart race. She had never seen so many motorcycles in one place before. They moved like a massive, coordinated swarm, each bike painted with the same gleaming chrome, their riders clad in dark leather jackets. As they neared, Sarah's breath hitched. She recognized the silhouette of the elderly man, the one who had been bullied earlier. He was at the head of the pack, riding effortlessly, his posture straight, and his expression one of quiet authority. His leather jacket gleamed in the streetlight, the patches on it now visible in the glow. They weren't just ordinary biker patches, these were military-grade insignia, symbols of a brotherhood Sarah had only seen in movies or documentaries. But how was he leading them? How had he gone from the frail, quiet old man she had seen moments ago to a leader of this massive biker gang? The first wave of motorcycles rolled into the diner's parking lot, their engines growling like a beast in pain. They didn't stop, didn't slow down. The riders dismounted in perfect unison, their heavy boots hitting the pavement with synchronized precision. Sarah's mouth went dry. She couldn't process it fast enough. There were so many of them, at least 200, maybe more. Then, as if by command, the group parted, making way for the man she had helped earlier. He rode forward slowly, his motorcycle gliding toward her. The old man was now stripped of his helmet, his graying hair blowing gently in the wind. There was no sign of the frailty he had shown earlier. His face was now sharp, proud, and full of an energy she hadn't expected. He was no longer just the old man from the diner, he was someone else entirely. Sarah felt a mixture of awe and fear as he stopped in front of her, the massive crowd of bikers now behind him, watching her with an intensity that made her feel like a small fish in a vast ocean. He looked down at her, his eyes searching her face for something, but she had no idea what. His gaze held an unexpected depth, as though he could see through the confusion and uncertainty in her mind. "You saved me," he said, his voice low but clear, cutting through the noise around them. "And for that, you will be rewarded." Sarah blinked in disbelief. Rewarded? She hadn't done it for a reward. She had done it because she couldn't stand to see him bullied, because it was the right thing to do. But she didn't speak those words. She just nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Her mind was still reeling from the sheer magnitude of the situation. "Who are you?" she managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. The old man smiled, though it wasn't a smile of kindness. It was a knowing smile, one that suggested he held all the answers to questions she hadn't even thought to ask yet. "I am someone who has spent a long time watching the world from the sidelines. But no more." He paused, allowing the words to sink in. "My name is Joseph." Before Sarah could respond, the large man who had spoken earlier, the one with the beard, stepped forward. His broad shoulders cast a shadow over Sarah, and she instinctively took a step back. The biker towered over her, his expression serious. "Joseph's not just some old man. He's a leader, a warrior. And these," he gestured to the other bikers, "are his brothers. You've caught their attention. And that's not something you do by accident." Sarah felt the weight of his words settle on her chest like a lead brick. She had caught their attention. Why? How? She had only done what anyone would have done, right? But why all of this? "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly as the questions swirled in her mind. Joseph's eyes softened slightly. "You'll understand soon enough, Sarah. But first, we need to talk." Before she could protest, one of the bikers, a shorter woman with a scar running down her cheek, approached with a clipboard. She handed it to Joseph without a word, her face unreadable. The woman's presence was commanding, and Sarah could tell she wasn't someone to be crossed. She could feel the power in the way the woman stood. Joseph scanned the clipboard, his eyes narrowing as he read through whatever was written on it. The crowd behind him was still, all of them waiting for something. Sarah's heart beat faster. She had no idea what was happening, but she knew it wasn't good. "This is more than just some random act of kindness," Joseph said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "We've been watching you for a while, Sarah. We've been watching your struggle." "My struggle?" she echoed, confused. "What do you mean? I haven't been struggling." "You think that?" Joseph raised an eyebrow. "You think this life is just about working a job, going home, and repeating the same thing every day? No. You've been struggling against something much bigger than yourself, even if you don't realize it yet." The words hung in the air like an unspoken truth. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She was about to ask him what he meant, but before she could, the short woman with the scar spoke again. "Joseph," she said, her voice low but steady. "We need to leave. We don't have much time." Joseph's expression darkened, and for the first time, Sarah saw a flicker of something deep in his eyes. Was it fear? No. It was urgency. He turned back to her, his gaze intense. "You need to come with us, Sarah. Right now." The words were like a slap to her face. Her mind raced. What was happening? Who were these people? Why was this happening to her? "I can't just leave," she protested, her voice shaking. "I don't even know who you are. What do you want from me?" Joseph sighed, as though he had been expecting her reaction. He stepped closer, his presence overpowering. "We want nothing from you, Sarah. But the world, it wants everything from you." Suddenly, everything felt too real. The bikers. The mystery, the urgency, it was all crashing down on her. The once peaceful, quiet night had been turned into something dangerous, something she had never anticipated. Joseph turned to his group, his voice commanding. "We move out in 5 minutes. Get the bikes ready." Without another word, the bikers began moving in perfect coordination. Some went to the bikes, others to the cars parked nearby. Sarah stood there, still processing everything. She didn't know what was happening, but one thing was clear: her life had just changed forever. And the twists were only beginning. The wind howled through the empty streets as Sarah's mind raced. The realization of what had just happened hit her like a ton of bricks. She had always thought her life was simple, working at the diner, dealing with everyday problems, struggling to pay bills, keeping a low profile. Now, everything had changed. In a matter of hours, she had gone from a waitress to someone caught up in an unknown world of bikers, leaders, and secrets. Joseph's words replayed in her head. "The world wants everything from you." What could that possibly mean? She had lived her life as a nobody, just another face in the crowd. Yet, here she was, standing at the heart of something much bigger than herself, surrounded by people who seemed to know everything about her and more. As Joseph's group prepared to leave, Sarah felt the weight of their gazes. The other bikers moved with a sense of purpose, none of them speaking much, as though they had a clear objective. Even the woman with the scar, who had barely said a word to her, had an air of silent authority. The entire group was operating like a well-oiled machine, and Sarah was just the outsider, someone who had no idea why she was here or what she was supposed to do next. "Get in the van," Joseph called to her. He stood by a sleek black van, its windows tinted so dark that it was almost impossible to see inside. Sarah hesitated. "Where are we going?" "You'll find out soon enough," Joseph replied, his voice a mixture of calm and urgency. "Trust me, this is the safest place for you right now." Her instincts screamed for her to run, to get as far away from these people as possible. But something kept her there, something in Joseph's eyes. There was a fire in them, a quiet desperation that didn't quite match the calm, confident exterior he wore. And then there was the strange sense of fate that seemed to have guided her here. She had saved him, but why? Was there more to it? Was it really just an accident? Taking a deep breath, Sarah finally made her decision. She had no choice but to follow them. Maybe, just maybe, she would find answers. She stepped into the van, the door closing behind her with a soft hiss. As the engine roared to life, she glanced around at the dark, shadowy interior. The seats were covered in black leather, the air thick with the scent of motor oil and dust. Joseph sat in the front, his face expressionless, his eyes focused on the road ahead. The woman with the scar sat beside Sarah, her presence as unnerving as ever. Sarah didn't know if she was supposed to talk to her, but the woman made no effort to engage. As the van sped through the quiet streets, the world outside seemed to blur, lost in the dark corners of her mind. The silence in the vehicle was deafening, broken only by the occasional hum of the tires against the pavement. She felt isolated, disconnected, like she was in a different world altogether. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being pulled into something she wasn't prepared for, something far beyond her understanding. The van finally pulled off the main road and into an old industrial area. The buildings here were worn down, abandoned. The air smelled of rust and old metal. Sarah's heart began to race again. Where were they taking her? What was all of this about? Joseph didn't say a word as he parked the van in front of a large, nondescript warehouse. The place looked completely out of place, hidden away from the world like a forgotten relic. Sarah glanced at the other bikers who had followed them in a convoy. They were already gathering outside, moving like soldiers preparing for something. The door opened, and Joseph stepped out, his boots hitting the pavement with a thud. The woman with the scar followed suit, her hand resting on her holster. Sarah took a deep breath and stepped out of the van, her legs shaky beneath her. Joseph led her into the warehouse. It was darker inside, but there were lights hanging from the high ceiling that illuminated the large space. The floors were cluttered with boxes and equipment, most of it covered in dust. It didn't seem like a place people would come to do business, but Sarah had no idea what kind of business they were involved in. "You're safe here," Joseph said, his voice reassuring, though the tension in the air suggested otherwise. "No one will find you." Sarah glanced around, trying to make sense of everything. "Why am I here? What is this place?" Joseph didn't answer right away. Instead, he motioned for her to sit at a nearby table. "There are things you don't understand yet. But you will. In time." He looked over his shoulder at the woman with the scar. "Clara, get the file." Clara nodded and disappeared into the back of the warehouse. Sarah's mind was racing. A file? What kind of file? What did they have on her? Moments later, Clara returned with a thick manila folder. She handed it to Joseph, who opened it carefully. Inside were a series of papers, photographs, documents, and what appeared to be records of some kind. "This is why you're here, Sarah," Joseph said, pushing the folder toward her. "This is your life." Sarah froze. The photographs inside the folder were of her, taken from places she didn't recognize. Some were old, others more recent. She had no idea how they got these pictures. The documents listed details about her life, her childhood, her family, her work history. How did they know all of this? Her hands trembled as she picked up one of the photographs. It showed her as a young child, no older than 5, standing in front of a house she didn't recognize. She had no memory of this place, but there she was, smiling in the picture. How could they possibly have this? These photos, Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "Where did you get these?" Joseph's face hardened. "You don't remember, do you?" "It's not surprising. It's been a long time. But everything you've been told about your life, everything you've believed, is a lie. Your past is more complicated than you think." Sarah felt like the ground beneath her feet was crumbling. What was he talking about? A lie? What kind of lie? I don't understand. Who are you people? What do you want from me? Her voice cracked with desperation. Joseph leaned in, his eyes intense. We're part of something bigger than you can imagine, Sarah. And you're a part of it. Whether you realize it or not. The word sent a chill through her. She couldn't process everything he was saying. Was he suggesting that her entire life had been some sort of setup? That everything she had believed was just part of some twisted game? You have a choice, Sarah, Joseph continued. You can walk away. Go back to your life and forget all of this. But it won't change the fact that you're involved. Whether you like it or not. The silence in the room was deafening. Sarah could feel her heart pounding in her chest. There was no going back now. The weight of his words pressed down on her. She didn't know what to believe, but one thing was certain, her life had just taken a dark turn, and she was in too deep to get out. She looked at Joseph, her mind racing with 1,000 questions. What do you want from me? Joseph's expression softened, just slightly. You'll find out soon enough. But first, you need to understand the truth about your past. The whole truth. And trust me, it's more than you ever imagined. As he spoke, Clara stepped forward again, this time with a different file in hand. She handed it to Sarah. This is your real history, Clara said quietly. Everything you thought you knew. It's time to learn the truth. Sarah's hands shook as she opened the file. Inside was more information, more details, more names, more photographs. And the deeper she dug, the more she realized how little she knew about her own life. The truth was buried deep, and it was waiting to be uncovered. But was she ready to face it? And more importantly, was she ready to face what she had become a part of? Sarah sat alone in the cold, dimly lit room, the file spread out before her like an open wound. Each page she turned felt like it was peeling back another layer of her life, exposing secrets that had been buried for years. Her hands trembled as she looked at the photographs, the names, the dates, everything. Pointing to a past she had no memory of. It was as if someone had stolen her identity, rewritten it, and left her to live a lie. The truth was too much to process all at once. She had always been told that her childhood had been ordinary, even boring. But now, these photos suggested something far more sinister. Who were these people in the pictures? They weren't family, yet they were familiar. Some of them looked like they were watching her, waiting for something. A sharp knock on the door snapped her out of her thoughts. It was Joseph, his expression unreadable as he stepped into the room. Behind him, Clara loomed like a shadow, her cold eyes fixed on Sarah. Have you looked through everything? Joseph asked, his voice low and controlled. Sarah didn't answer immediately. She wasn't sure she could. I don't understand any of this. Why didn't you tell me? Why all these secrets? Joseph walked over to the table and sat across from her. His gaze softened, but only for a moment. You weren't ready, he said quietly. No one is ever ready for the truth about themselves. Sarah shook her head, feeling the weight of his words like a heavy stone pressing against her chest. I don't even know who I am anymore. Joseph leaned forward, his eyes fixed on hers. You are someone special, Sarah. More special than you realize. Your life was never meant to be ordinary. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. What did he mean by that? Special? What does that even mean? Clara stepped forward now, her voice surprisingly gentle. You weren't born into this life, Sarah. You were chosen. But that doesn't make it any easier. The truth about your past, it's hard for anyone to accept. Sarah's thoughts swirled like a storm. Chosen? Her mind refused to make sense of it. Chosen for what? She whispered, barely able to speak the words. "What are you talking about?" Joseph took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving hers. "You were meant to be part of something bigger. A purpose you don't even know yet. The truth is, your parents, your real parents, were part of a group, a very powerful group, that had to protect you. But they didn't want you to know. They kept you away from it all, gave you a normal life, thinking you would be safer that way." Sarah stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the concrete floor. "My real parents? What do you mean? Who are they? Why didn't they tell me?" Clara stepped closer, placing a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "They had no choice. It was for your own protection. There were people out there who would have used you for their own gain. Your family, your real family, had to hide you. To keep you safe." Sarah's mind was reeling. This was too much to process. She had never known anything about her biological parents. All she had known was the couple who had adopted her when she was a baby. They were kind, loving, but they had always kept a distance. There were things they never spoke about, things she had never understood. Joseph reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope. He slid it across the table to Sarah. "Inside this envelope is the last piece of the puzzle. You need to know who you really are, Sarah. It's time to face it." With trembling hands, Sarah tore open the envelope. Inside was a birth certificate. But this wasn't her usual birth certificate. It was older, yellowed with age. The name listed on the certificate was not Sarah's. It was a name she had never heard before. "Isabel Green," she whispered, almost to herself. "Who is Isabel Green?" Joseph nodded slowly. "That's your real name. Isabel Green." Sarah's heart stopped. She felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Isabel Green? The name felt like a distant echo, something she should recognize but didn't. She had never heard it before. Her entire life had been built around the name Sarah. Her adoptive parents, her job at the diner, the few friends she had, they all knew her as Sarah. But Isabel Green was the name on this certificate. The name that tied her to something, to someone she didn't know. Joseph's voice broke through her thoughts. "You were born into a family of influence. Your father, Victor Green, was a key figure in an underground network that operated outside of the law, but for good. They protected people, dealt with criminals, and made sure the balance of power stayed in check. Your mother was part of the same world." Sarah shook her head, trying to make sense of what he was saying. Her mind was spinning, and the room seemed to close in on her. The words felt unreal, like a bad dream she couldn't wake up from. "This is insane. This can't be true." Joseph leaned back, his face hardening. "It's true. Your real parents left you because they couldn't keep you safe any longer. When they realized you were a target, they made the decision to hide you away, give you a normal life. But now, the time has come. The people who were after you are closing in." Clara's voice was like ice. "We have to get you ready, Isabel. We don't have much time." Sarah stared at the papers in front of her, the weight of the truth pressing down on her chest. Everything she thought she knew about her life was a lie. The world she had been living in was not the one she was meant to inhabit. But now, the truth was out, and it had come crashing down on her. "Why me?" she whispered, barely able to form the words. "Why was I chosen for all of this?" Joseph's eyes softened. "You were born with something special, Isabel. A gift, or perhaps a curse, depending on how you look at it. The truth is, you have abilities your real parents believed could change the course of things. But it's not just about the power. It's about who you are, what you stand for." Sarah's thoughts were racing now, too fast for her to keep up. "What abilities? I don't have any abilities. I'm just a normal woman." Joseph's gaze hardened again. "You may not know it yet, but you're not just anyone. Your family's enemies know it, and they've been watching you. They've been waiting for you to realize it. And when you do, everything will change. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. The reality of what Joseph was saying was hitting her like a freight train. She wasn't just a waitress in a small-town diner. She wasn't just Sarah. She was someone else entirely. Someone with a past that was too dangerous to know, and a future that was too uncertain to face. "What do I do now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Joseph stood up, his expression darkening. "You need to prepare. There's no time to waste. We need to protect you before they find you first." Clara placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "This is just the beginning. But we'll be with you every step of the way." Sarah looked from one to the other, fear and confusion swirling inside her. Her life was about to be turned upside down. The truth was out, but she had no idea what would happen next. But one thing was certain, her world would never be the same again. The wind howled through the cracked windows of the dilapidated house where Sarah sat, her mind still reeling from the revelation of the past few days. She felt like a stranger in her own life, a puppet on strings being yanked this way and that by forces she couldn't understand. It had all happened so fast, the discovery of her real name, the truth about her parents, and the chilling warning that those who sought her were closing in. Joseph had left hours ago, telling her that she needed to prepare. Clara had stayed behind, offering her quiet comfort, but even she couldn't hide the tension in her eyes. They were no longer safe. None of them were. As Sarah stared at the walls of the small, cold room, she realized something she hadn't allowed herself to consider until now. Her life was no longer in her control. The world she had known, the one she had fought so hard to carve out for herself, had been nothing but an illusion. A bubble that had burst, leaving her exposed. She wasn't Sarah anymore. She was Isabel Green, the daughter of powerful, dangerous people with enemies who had been watching her for years. "Are you okay?" Clara's voice cut through her thoughts, soft but firm. Sarah looked up at her, seeing the worry etched on Clara's face. The woman had been by her side since the moment she discovered the truth, but Sarah could see the struggle behind Clara's calm exterior. This was a fight neither of them had signed up for. And yet, they had no choice but to face it head-on. "I don't know," Sarah said, her voice shaky. She stood up and walked toward the window, staring out into the night. The street below was quiet, the only sound the distant hum of traffic. But the silence felt ominous, like the calm before a storm. She could feel it in her bones, something was coming. "What am I supposed to do now, Clara? How do I even begin to understand all of this?" Clara moved to stand beside her. "One step at a time," she said. "Joseph's right. We need to get you ready. But there's more you need to know, Isabel." "More?" Sarah turned to face Clara, her eyes wide. "How much more? I can't process all of this. My parents, they were part of some underground network, some group of people who protected others, but what does that have to do with me?" Clara took a deep breath, her gaze steady. "Your parents weren't just anyone, Isabel. They were part of an organization that kept a balance in the world. They were the gatekeepers. There are others, people who have access to power, real power, that most of the world doesn't even know exists. And that power is at risk now." "Risk?" Sarah's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" "They're coming for you. The people who want what your family has. They know who you are now, and they'll stop at nothing to use you, or worse, to destroy you." Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "But why me? Why now? Why didn't they come after me before?" Clara's eyes darkened. "Because they were waiting. Waiting for you to awaken to your true self. Your abilities, Isabel. Your power." "My power?" Sarah's voice cracked. "I don't have any power. I'm just a normal person. Just a waitress. A regular woman. Clara shook her head, her tone firm but sympathetic. You're not just anyone, Isabel. You've always had a gift, but your parents kept it hidden. They wanted you to have a normal life, to live without the dangers they had to face. But now, those dangers are here. And you're the only one who can stop them. Sarah took a step back, her mind racing. A gift? A power? None of this made sense. She felt more like a pawn in someone else's game than a player. And yet, a small part of her, some deep, buried part of her, knew that Clara wasn't lying. There was something inside her. Something waiting to be unlocked. I don't know if I can do this, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't even know where to begin. You don't have to do it alone, Clara said softly. You have us. Joseph, me. We'll help you. But first, you need to learn how to protect yourself. Sarah swallowed hard. She couldn't let fear rule her. Not now. Not when there were so many lives at stake. She had been given a chance to be more than she had ever imagined. And she couldn't waste it. Okay, she said, her voice stronger now. What do I need to do? Clara's eyes softened with approval. The first thing is to learn about the network. Your parents were leaders in it. But there's more to it than that. You need to understand your family's role, your role, in this world. There are people out there who will want to use you, Isabel. You need to be ready for them. The words sank into Sarah's mind like stones, each one heavy with the weight of the responsibility she now carried. She had no idea where to begin, but she knew she had to try. For herself. For everyone she cared about. The next few days were a blur of training, research, and harsh reality. Joseph and Clara took turns teaching Sarah what they knew about the world she had been thrust into. They didn't sugarcoat anything, there was no time for that. She had to learn quickly, or she would be the one caught off guard. And she would never forgive herself if someone else paid the price for her ignorance. She spent hours poring over documents, reading about the network her parents had been a part of, and the history of the organization they had helped to build. It was all so much to take in, far more than she could absorb in a few days. But the more she learned, the more she began to see patterns in her own life that she had never noticed before. Little things. Moments that, when looked at through this new lens, suddenly made sense. Her adopted parents, the ones who had raised her, had always been more than they seemed. Sarah had always known there was something off about them, but she had never dared question it. They had sheltered her, yes, but they had also kept her isolated. They had taught her to trust no one, to keep her distance from the world around her. Looking back, Sarah realized they had been preparing her for something, though she hadn't known what that something was. Now, she did. The network her parents had been a part of was far-reaching, with fingers in every corner of the world. It wasn't just an underground organization, it was a shadow government, working behind the scenes to protect the world from people who sought to control it for their own gain. Powerful men and women who had spent their lives building an empire of influence, wealth, and control. And Isabel, Sarah, was the key to it all. It was the power she had inherited from her parents, a power that she didn't yet fully understand, that made her such a threat. It wasn't just that she could unlock the network's secrets. It was that she could change the balance of power. She could expose the corruption, or she could join it. The choice was hers. But if she made the wrong move, there would be no going back. As the days passed, the tension grew. Joseph and Clara's warnings became more urgent. They had already been forced to relocate twice, each time moving deeper into the shadows. Sarah didn't understand why they were so worried about being found. But with each passing day, she began to feel it too, the sense of being hunted, of having unseen eyes on her every move. The weight of it was suffocating. It wasn't until the third day, when Sarah was sitting in the dimly lit room, reading through yet another dossier, that she realized the truth. She had no choice. She had to face this. There was no running from it anymore. She wasn't just a waitress in a small town. She wasn't just Isabel Green. She was something more. And if she didn't rise to meet the challenge, it would be the end of her. And everyone she loved. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind of tension that makes every breath feel like it might be your last. Sarah had been running for what felt like days. Every night, she lay awake, listening to the faint sounds of footsteps in the distance, the whisper of voices carried on the wind. It wasn't paranoia, it was reality. She wasn't alone anymore. The world had become a chessboard, and she was at the center of it, a pawn caught between forces too powerful for her to comprehend fully. Clara and Joseph had been her lifeline, offering support, guidance, and, most importantly, protection. But she knew this was the end. They couldn't protect her forever. Sooner or later, someone would find her. And when that happened, everything she'd fought for would be ripped away in an instant. And yet, as much as the fear gnawed at her, there was something else, something far deeper, that kept her going. The power she had inherited from her parents was no longer something she could ignore. She could feel it inside her, like a current running just beneath the surface, waiting for her to tap into it. She wasn't just Sarah anymore. She was Isabel Green, a woman with a destiny that she couldn't escape. The problem was, she wasn't sure what that destiny was. Joseph had spoken often about the choice she would have to make, the one that would determine not only her future but the fate of the world. He'd tried to prepare her, but no amount of training or reading could truly prepare her for the moment that was coming. She would have to choose between two paths, one that would change the world forever and one that would condemn her to a life in the shadows. It was late afternoon when Clara walked into the room, her face grim. The moment Sarah saw her, she knew. "We don't have much time," Clara said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "Have they found us?" Sarah's heart skipped a beat, her mind already racing. Clara nodded. "We've been compromised. We need to move. Now." Sarah stood up, her legs trembling. She hadn't felt fear like this since the first time she learned the truth about her parents. But this was different. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about the choices she had to make. "Where are we going?" she asked, trying to steady her breathing. "We're heading to the safe house," Clara replied. "Joseph is already there. We'll regroup, but we need to stay ahead of them. You've seen what they can do. We can't afford to make any mistakes." Sarah didn't have time to ask questions. The weight of everything that had happened in the past few days crashed down on her all at once, and she felt the full weight of responsibility pressing against her chest. She wasn't just hiding anymore. She wasn't just surviving. She was about to become the most wanted woman in the world, and it was her power that made her a target. She followed Clara out of the small house, into the dim light of the fading afternoon. The streets were eerily quiet, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, was watching. The drive to the safe house was long and tense, the road stretching out before them like an endless void. Sarah's mind was spinning. She couldn't keep up. Too many pieces of the puzzle were missing, and every time she thought she had a grip on the situation, another twist came along to throw her off balance. They arrived at the safe house in the early hours of the morning. It was a nondescript building, located on a deserted street at the edge of town. No one would think to look there. But that didn't mean it was safe. Not for long. Joseph was waiting for them when they arrived. His face was haggard, but his eyes were sharp, alert. "It's getting worse," he said, his voice low. "They've been tracking us for days. I don't know how much longer we can stay ahead of them." Sarah nodded, her mind whirling. She didn't want to admit it, but she knew he was right. There was no more running. There was no more hiding. The people after her weren't just chasing her, they were closing in. And it was only a matter of time before they found her. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, feeling the weight of her voice. Joseph didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, his expression serious. "The time has come, Isabel. You have to decide." "Decide what?" Sarah asked, her heart pounding. "What do you mean?" Joseph took a deep breath. "You know what I'm talking about. The choice you've been avoiding. You've been trained for this moment your entire life, even though you didn't know it." Sarah's throat went dry. She had known this day would come, the day when she would have to face the truth of her power, the truth of her parents' legacy. But hearing Joseph say it out loud made it all too real. "Choose the path of power, Isabel, and you can take control of the network. You'll have the strength to shape the future, to stop the corruption that's threatening to tear this world apart. You'll have the tools to make the world a better place." "And the other option?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Joseph's gaze darkened. "The other option is to walk away. To leave it all behind. You'll disappear. We'll protect you, and you can live a normal life. But you'll always be looking over your shoulder. Always wondering when they'll find you. And the world will keep spinning, spinning toward destruction." It was a stark choice. A terrifying one. Sarah sat down, her mind racing. Could she really take control? Could she handle the power her parents had left behind? What if she failed? What if she became the very thing she was trying to fight? "What do you think I should do?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Joseph didn't answer immediately. He walked over to the window, staring out at the dark street below. "I think you already know," he said after a long pause. "You've always known. You've always had the strength to make this decision, Isabel. It's just a matter of whether you're ready to face it." The next few hours were a blur of motion. Clara and Joseph helped Sarah prepare, but the entire time, she felt like she was moving in slow motion, as though the world was spinning around her faster than she could keep up. Finally, the moment came. She had to make a choice. It wasn't the power that scared her. It wasn't the potential to shape the future. It was what came with that power, the enemies she would make, the lives she would affect. She didn't want to hurt anyone. But deep down, she knew that this wasn't just about her anymore. It never had been. The fate of so many others rested in her hands. "Isabel," Joseph said, his voice steady but full of meaning. "You can't change the world if you're afraid to fight for it." And with that, Sarah made her choice. The room grew still as she stood, her heart pounding in her chest. The final decision had been made, and there was no going back. She was ready. The end. Or is it? This journey was not just one of survival, but one of discovery, of power, and the ultimate lesson: sometimes, you must make the hardest decisions in life. But the hardest choices often lead to the greatest growth. In this final part, Sarah chooses her path, accepting the responsibility and power that comes with her parents' legacy. She understands that the world is not black and white. It's a murky gray where every decision has consequences. Will she rise above it all, or will she fall victim to the very forces she's trying to fight? The future remains uncertain, but her destiny is hers to control.